Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our January 11th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Wheeler, and this is our first episode of 2021, and it could not have come soon enough. We're going to get things started off on the right foot in this new year by sharing the most important state legislative issues farmers are facing in 2021, and by introducing Iowa Farm Bureau's new Economic Summit webinar series. That webinar series starts later this week, and it's going to feature a full slate of nationally renowned speakers who will answer your questions about the economic drivers for ag in 2021 and how you can use that information to lock in profits and manage risk on your farm. Of course, Iowa's legislative session starts today, so let's kick off the episode with Matt Steinfeldt. Matt is a state policy advisor for Iowa Farm Bureau, and he's going to preview the state legislative priorities for Farm Bureau members in 2021. Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel has the story.
We're visiting today with Matt Steinfeldt, Iowa Farm Bureau state policy advisors, to look ahead to the 2021 Iowa legislative session, which begins January 11th. Matt, let's start with a look at the state's fiscal 22 budget, which will be debated this session. What will Farm Bureau members be focusing on as lawmakers work through the budgeting process?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. One of the main areas of focus this year, along with every other year, is making sure property taxpayers are protected as the legislature sets their current budget. As you know, the state budget is made up of sales and income tax, but a lot of decisions they make, both through the appropriations process and on the policy bill, can have a big impact on Iowans' property tax bills back home. These can be the every year items such as the homestead property tax credit, the ag land family farm property tax credit, and making sure those are adequately funded. We also work on things such as the K-12 property tax replacement payments, which this current fiscal year saved property taxpayers $75 million. And this mechanism must be extended into this upcoming budget and future fiscal years. Our members work on property taxes every year because it has a big impact on their farm, and I know on a lot of Iowans out there too. Statewide, Iowans paid over $6.3 billion in property taxes this year. That figure is outpacing our economy. It's outpacing Iowans' ability to pay. And a lot of decisions that are made, or most importantly, sometimes not made at the Capitol, can have a big impact on your property tax bill. And that's why our members will continue to work on property taxes every year, including this year at the session.
Matt, Farm Bureau members have expressed concern about the state's system of using property taxes to fund mental health services. Why are members concerned about the current funding source, and what solutions could make the system more equitable for taxpayers?
Our members are concerned because the current method of utilizing property taxes to pay for mental health creates inequities for Iowa taxpayers. The solution is for the state to make mental health a priority in their budget and assume the costs of the mental health system and remove that from the backs of property taxpayers. Anytime you utilize property taxes to pay for a people service, you inherently create inequities. For example, in Iowa, there's inequities between what those in unincorporated parts of the state contribute compared to those who live in the incorporated parts of Iowa. Iowa's mental health system has evolved a lot over the past few years, and now is the time to transition the cost to the state budget. If the legislature makes mental health a priority and begins to assume the cost of the system, it will not only provide dollar-for-dollar property tax relief for Iowans, but it will also ensure that Iowa is utilizing an equitable funding source to pay for our mental health system.
During their policy session back in September, Farm Bureau delegates voted to advocate for an ethanol standard in Iowa. Why is establishing a standard important, and how would it change the current situation for ethanol sales in the state?
It's important to our members because we want to make sure that Iowa is doing everything it can to promote renewable fuels and creating an ethanol standard in Iowa would help accomplish this. As you guys know, Iowa is the number one ethanol producing state, but we lag other states in ethanol market share. The legislature can help address this by creating an ethanol standard for on-road fuels sold in Iowa. So in essence, E10 would be our primary fuel, not E0 at the pump. Our neighbors to the north and south, Minnesota and Missouri, have each had an E10 standard for years. We are going to follow the same common sense approach with exemptions for certain engines while still increasing ethanol's market share. Renewable fuels are critical to Iowa jobs, rural communities, and Iowa farmers. And our members look forward to working with the legislature to help ensure that Iowa is doing everything that it can to promote renewable fuels.
Matt, another key issue for Farm Bureau is creating a farm driving permit for minors. How would that work? And why is it so important for farm families?
The farm permit would be very similar to the current school permit program. The student would have to be 14 and a half years old. They must have already passed a test, and they would already have their school permit. So basically, it would just allow them, once they meet all that criteria, it would allow them to drive a passenger vehicle to help out on the farm. Much like a 14 and a half year old who has already passed a test and has their permit can drive to school to participate in activities, participate in sports, it would allow 14 and a half year olds to help out on the farm. This would create efficiencies for family farmers. It's a common sense approach. It's something some of our neighboring states are doing, and we're hopeful the legislature will allow Iowa's youth to utilize this provision to continue to help out on the farm.
Farm Bureau members have been strong advocates for funding state programs to improve water quality and conserve soil. What will be the focus for Farm Bureau in the upcoming session in terms of water quality and soil conservation, Matt?
Our members will continue to focus on keep moving forward and constantly making progress on nitrogen and phosphorus. The legislature has taken a lot of positive steps the past few years. For example, Senate File 512, which is long-term dedicated funding for our Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. That funding fully ramped up this current fiscal year and will continue on for the next several years. Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy is our path to address nitrogen and phosphorus. It's science-based. It's a partnership between rural and urban. It includes DNR, it includes IDOLs, it includes science from Iowa State. And in fact, EPA points to our nutrient reduction strategy as a model for other states to follow when they want to address nitrogen and phosphorus as well. So this upcoming session, our members will work with the legislature to protect the funding for Senate File 512 that is now fully ramped up, as well as the record investments that Iowa is making in the other programs that help address water quality and soil conservation.
Matt, it sounds like it's going to be an interesting and exciting year, especially as we work through the pandemic. What other ag issues could come up in this session?
We will analyze all tax proposals, policy proposals, and other bills that come up and react accordingly depending on the policy that our members have set for us. We'll continue to advocate for farmers every day at the Capitol. Our members will continue to be engaged with their legislators and make sure that farmers back home are communicating with them on these important policies. And we'll continue to look out for our members' interests, for agriculture's interests, and rural Iowa's interests as this session moves forward.
It's definitely going to be a one-of-a-kind legislative session on the heels of 2020 and in the midst of a continuing pandemic. But if there's one constant, it's Farm Bureau's work on behalf of our members. And we appreciate Matt coming on the podcast to share the latest on the state policy front. If you'd like to learn more about Farm Bureau's plans for 2021 on both the state and national levels, I'd encourage you to check out a new column by Iowa Farm Bureau President Craig Hill. We've linked President Hill's column to the notes for this episode, so click there to read it after you've finished listening. But before you do that, you'll definitely want to hear the second part of this episode about Iowa Farm Bureau's upcoming Economic Summit webinar series. You know, it's not very often that you get a chance to ask questions of ag experts, like the incoming and outgoing chief economist for USDA, but that's exactly the opportunity you'll have through this webinar series, which begins on Thursday, January 14th. Iowa Farm Bureau's Senior Economist Dr. Sam Funk put together the upcoming webinar series, and late last month he sat down with Spokesman reporter Tom Block to discuss what's in store for farmers and ag professionals who sign up for this series.
We're visiting today with Iowa Farm Bureau's Senior Economist Sam Funk to get a preview of Farm Bureau's Economic Summit webinar series. Sam, give us some of the highlights of the webinar series you will host over 6 sessions beginning January 14th.
Well, the first thing that you need to talk about when we talk about this economic series is really the fact that it's bringing a level of information to your computer during this odd year of COVID and how it's changed a lot of our meetings. We're not going to have a one-day session for the Economic Summit this year. We're going to instead have it be a virtual session, which is free for anyone to register for at iowafarmbureau.com. So we're going to bring in lots of experts, whether it be from within the state, looking at opportunities that we have to be able to manage forward with some of the economic conditions which have made such a difference in our marketplace this year in going into 2021, to taking it to a national scope and bringing in some experts for looking at overall farm income and those challenges which are taking place in U.S. agriculture, and then bringing an international flair to it. And this is one of the important parts for this event that's going to be this series, is to bring an international perspective, because we're not having as many people being able to travel this year with some of the restrictions with this global pandemic. So we want to bring in that information from outside of the shores of the United States for what it means for U.S. agriculture, so that we can think strategically going forward, but also make decisions for today with what those economic conditions are.
Why do you think that gathering information from a wide range of experts at the summit is critically important for farmers and others in Iowa agriculture right now?
So it's really important when we think about all of the happenings that are taking place in this world, whether it's international trade, whether it's financial programs that are availing themselves to farmers, whether it's just the fact of what the markets are allowing us to do right now. This has been one of those interesting years where all of a sudden at the end of the year, we've got some grain prices. We're seeing the price for corn and the price for soybeans, which has become somewhat more attractive for those who are producing those commodities. And at the same time, we don't want to just expect that that's going to be the condition we're going to continue to see. We want to be able to plan forward, and those prices that we see right now give us that opportunity and that flexibility to look for some of those management techniques that we can put into play to understand exactly what those opportunities are going forward, and maybe in a longer term sequence that we could be able to put those plans into play. So bringing all of those experts together, we get a broader picture of agriculture, and we really want to focus in not on every subject matter underneath the sun, but what are the economics and what are those drivers behind the scenes that we need to understand so that we can make those decisions that are critical for the long-term profitability and the ability, frankly, for us to be able to have these farms which can thrive going forward instead of just survive.
Since harvest, we've seen a lot of volatility in the markets. How will farmers and landowners be able to utilize the information from the webinars as they set their marketing plans for 2021 and plan ahead for future years?
One of the most obvious aspects of that one is a session that we're going to have with Dr. Alejandro Plastina coming in to join us during one of our mid-sessions. What Dr. Plastina does, part of his programming up at Iowa State, is to come up with the cost of production reports on an annual basis looking forward for our corn and soybean producers. And so we're going to bring that information to the Economic Summit, and we're going to continue to look at what are the prices right now that we see on our futures markets telling us that's likely to happen for this next year, and then looking at a historical level of basis, how do we combine this information for what revenues could be across the state and what the cost of producing those crops could be across the state to make plans going forward for what does some of our historical information lead us to for opportunities that we see in the marketplace right now. And then going beyond that, we'll talk about some of the economic drivers that we see here in the state with Dr. Chad Hart and Dr. Lee Schultz. And we'll talk about the crop and the livestock side and what those drivers are that we're seeing seeing across the state? Where has COVID brought us to at this point in time, and what are the likely potential aspects we'll see going forward in any sort of a recovery from this pandemic? Obviously, one of the big news stories that we've seen recently is the aspect of looking at a vaccine for COVID-19. So if that comes into place, what could be the changes in our markets? But beyond that, what are the international drivers? What's going on with trade? What's going on with where we see product flowing? And these are really large challenges that we need to be able to bring some sense into. How does this impact Iowa? Obviously, our producers in Iowa are excellent and efficient producers with the bountiful natural resources that they manage. The next aspect of that one is, what does the world show us that it might have for demand for our crops and for those competing supplies that come from other markets?
Your kickoff webinar is with Rob Johansen, Chief USDA Economist. What insights will he be able to offer as farmers look ahead to 2021 and beyond?
Really, the aspect of having Rob Johansen with us is a multiple-fold aspect. So first, he wrote a very good blog summary which talked about this balancing act of pluses and minuses. There's a lot of positives that could shape into our marketplace, and Rob really wrote that even before we saw some of these very substantial gains in soybean and corn markets. But there was also some potential drawdowns that we could see into this going forward, and Rob has a unique role with USDA, looking at a lot of different subject matter and information that comes to bear in his role to be able to think about what are those drivers that could potentially either move prices continue on forward in an upward motion, or to bring them down rather quickly. If we think about some of those risks with trade, especially as you think about the juggernaut in the demand side of the equation on global trade being China, there's a lot of information there that I think we need to be able to consider. So having Rob in there was very fortunate for us to be able to bring him on. And then after we actually had Rob scheduled to join us, we actually found out that Rob is going to be leaving USDA for another role. And so we'll talk about some of what's happened over the years that Rob's been with USDA as their chief economist. But the fortunate aspect of that one is Dr. Seth Meyer, who's going to be the incoming chief economist that's been announced at USDA. Seth is going to join us for our final iteration of this series. So this series is going to go from January 14th, which is a Thursday, starting at 1 p.m. Central Time, and run through February 25th, which is again a Thursday at 1 p.m. Central. And Seth is going to give us that ending perspective. And at the time that Seth joins us, he will actually be the chief economist at USDA. So it's important that we think about some of the background that Seth brings. Seth, first off, is probably most important for a lot of people in the state of Iowa. He's an Iowa boy. So it's important that he actually had a very strong fondness when I first brought this topic up of him presenting to the Iowa Farm Bureau Economic Summit series. He thought that was an outstanding idea, but now that he's going to be at USDA, again, that's an important aspect. So what was his role first when he was at USDA? Seth was actually the chair of the World Agriculture Outlook Board, which puts together the WASDE report on a monthly basis. So that's the report that so much of the statistics and information that the world depends on to look at what's going on with agriculture is capsulized in one report. So Seth has a lot of information just from his background, but by this time, Seth would have been engaged as the chief economist at USDA and be able to bring that much more of a rich dialogue to us at that point in time. And he'll talk about some of the changes that he's seen and what we might be able to expect going forward with USDA in some of how we see some things shaping up with information that's coming to bear on U.S. agriculture going forward. So I think it's a really exciting aspect. For an economist like myself, it's exciting to see the chief economist from USDA, both outgoing and incoming, coming in. But this is, I think, a really special aspect that we have to bring forward to the Iowa Farm Bureau Economic Summit webinar series. And it really shows the strength that this organization has to be able to attract that type of talent to be able to come in and speak to us. And so I think it's a really important thing that our members are able to have that kind of feedback. So again, they've got some of that cutting edge information to consider in their planning going forward.
You've mentioned a couple times the importance of global markets and trade, and you have a webinar focused on Brazil set for January 21. That'll be held just as we start to get a good idea of how soybeans and corn farmers will harvest there. Why is it important for Iowa farmers to monitor trends in Brazilian agriculture?
Well, obviously, Brazilian agriculture has been one of those dominant changing forces in the global landscape. So actually, this last year, the market study tour from the Iowa Farm Bureau took a trip down to Brazil to be able to try to understand what those changing attributes are that we see. Our focus at that trip was to actually look at the northern arc, if you will, those soybeans and corn which are grown in Mato Grosso, which typically then now have this opportunity to go through that northern arc or up to the Amazon River to be exported. So we've already seen changes here in the last couple of years where it's now less expensive to send soybeans from the Amazon port at Santarém to Shanghai, China, than it is to ship soybeans from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Shanghai, China. So that's a very big, if you will, a sea change. And I mean that literally, because that's a difference in how those beans are going to go across an ocean to the primary export destination on the global scale. So when we think about these types of unique challenges that are happening, it's not just the northern arc. It's also the fact that obviously there's a lot of soybeans and corn and animal proteins which come out of the southern portion of Brazil as well. So we had the great fortune of having a guide with us on our market study tour by the name of Claudio. So Claudio is an agricultural guide, and that's part of what he does on a professional basis, is to take groups through Brazil and show them various aspects of the changing agriculture which is occurring in that, if you will, that upcoming juggernaut, which has obviously shown its prowess for being able to send not only soybeans, but also corn, pork, and beef into a global marketplace. And so we're going to have Claudio join us, not just for the 21 of us that are able to be at that market study tour and in the presentations we've made following, but we're going to have Claudio live with us on this one webinar session, and you'll be able to ask questions through a Zoom chat and type in your questions for what's taking place in Brazilian agriculture. And I've already told Claudio we're not focused in on just the statistics of what's going on out there. It's not just going to be this data-heavy aspect. It's what's really occurring down in Brazil. How do they make decisions? How are they looking at when they market a crop 2 years in advance? What are they doing? And part of that is thinking about how they're managing the value of their currency and using it to try to get a better market for their crop, and to still try to think about how they get the inputs brought in at a good price as well. It's a very difficult dynamic to think about because we're so used to thinking about how we do things on an annual basis in this state and in the United States. But how do they do this in Brazil when they're marketing a couple of years in advance? And what does that really mean for them? When we start to think about how much of their soybean crop and their corn crop that they tend to export in some way, their currency situation is vitally important. We have seen that with how much more crop they've had, that they have become that primary source when they've got availability for the global marketplace, that they are one of the first places that people go to because commodities get driven by a price point. And so they've been able to lead that price point by a weaker currency. That was exacerbated, that was made more to their advantage because of this global pandemic with COVID, because people flocked to the U.S. for stability in currency, and so they brought in and wanted U.S. dollars, which rose the strength of our U.S. dollar and made our exports relatively more expensive than Brazilian exports. So how does this shape up going forward, and what could be changing in that Brazilian landscape? And I think that's part of that exciting aspect of having Claudio come to visit with us virtually to talk about just how Brazil could be shaping up going forward in a post-pandemic period.
We all know that 2020 was a turbulent year in agriculture markets. Do you expect that volatility to continue into 2021 and into the long term?
I think if there's anything that 2020 showed us is that there can be significant swings in how global markets and how policies and how just the economics of what's taking place in the marketplace will potentially shift in a very large degree what we can do in our markets, both in Iowa, in the United States, and then around the world even. So if we're going to think about how some of these drivers come to play, that gives us even that much more focus on what information can we glean from having these not just local but also global experts come into play to give us this information that we can make those changes and shifts, not just thinking about policy with your organization within the Farm Bureau, but also thinking about how can we make these shifts to protect ourselves and to manage the risk on the farms. And what are those risks? Because those risks, as we know, can be significant. If you would have thought at the beginning of the year, and we did back in February after we had the Iowa State University cost of production levels out, we actually looked at some potential for soybeans and corn to not lose money in this current marketing year. Then we went through the depths of that COVID period where it was a challenge to find prices if you were selling corn and soybeans that were favorable. And then at the end of the year, it changed completely again when you had all of a sudden you were able to market soybeans for over $10 a bushel off of the combine in several areas around the state. So those are significant shifts, and it shows us how deeply those shifts can take place. It really kind of felt like a yo-yo, if you will. It started out with the yo-yo somewhat high, then fairly low, and then back to even a higher level. So what can we do going forward to manage those risks? This is not the time to just think, well, prices are going to continue at this level or potentially go higher, and they could go higher. And I think that's also a risk for some people who are thinking about cash rental rates. It's also a risk for our livestock producers to think about how they're going to lock in prices for feed this next go around, or for those who are potentially invested into an ethanol plant for what's one, the risk for being able to produce more ethanol going off into 2021, and two, what's the price of the corn, which is the primary input in this state for those ethanol plants. So where are we going to land? And I think that's the aspect of a large deal of uncertainty, and with that comes some risk. And how do you manage that risk when you need to be able to bring that information to bear? And while we may not have all of the exact answers for where we're going toward, we can look at the opportunities and the challenges that are in front of us and what those specific drivers might be that we can look forward to.
If you're looking for actionable economic info from some of Ag's leading experts, I can't think of a better way to kick off 2021. And it's really easy. Just head out to iowafarmbureau.com/economic summit, or simply click the link in the notes for this podcast episode to read more about our 6-part Economic Summit webinar series and to get registered. And remember, registration is free, and the series starts on Thursday, January 14th, with outgoing USDA Chief Economist Dr. Rob Johansen. So get yourself registered today. And while you're headed out to iowafarmbureau.com, I'll tell you about a few other free events for you to consider. The first is our popular Young Farmer Conference, which we'll be delivering virtually on Friday, January 29th and Saturday, January 30th. That conference is open to Iowa Farm Bureau members. Yes, the format is different than years past, when we've welcomed hundreds of young farmers to Des Moines. But as always, we're offering some top-notch speakers and educational breakout sessions. So if you're a young farmer or ag professional who's an Iowa Farm Bureau member, you'll want to get registered for that event today. The second event is a webinar about livestock risk protection, which is an insurance plan designed to protect against a decline in market price. That free webinar will be January 20th. And again, all 3 of these upcoming events, the Economic Summit webinar series, the Young Farmer Conference, and the Livestock Risk Protection webinar, are all linked to the notes for this podcast episode. And of course, you can also find all of them and get registered at iowafarmbureau.com. That's going to wrap up this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I hope you'll join us for our next regularly scheduled episode on January 25th. In the meantime, I encourage you to register for those terrific educational opportunities and get your 2021 off to a great start. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to The Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.